We have an opportunity this afternoon, well, at least this afternoon here, East Coast time, to explore a topic of such critical importance. Words weave the way of the world around us. Words can provoke anger, they can provoke inclusion, and paying attention to how we encapsulate and describe and use words for metadata is such an important topic in the world that we live in today. Hence our session entitled, formally, Words Really Do Matter, How to Manage Metadata and Why This is Important. Each of our panelists will introduce themselves and have been kind enough to prepare a presentation to help set the stage and draw a bit of a circle around this topic from various and different perspectives. Sharon, it's been delightful to work with you in getting your presentation ready, and we're going to turn over the magic of Zoom to you, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Oh, that's the wrong one, isn't it?
While Sharon is pulling this up, we have
Sorry.
about 10 minutes for each presentation. Please put your questions into the Q&A box on the conference platform, and we've allocated a full 30 minutes for conversation and discussion.
I don't know why it's not showing the slide. Is that, Are you seeing my full slide or are you seeing the presenter view?
No, this is the full slide.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Anyway, hello, everybody. So my name is Sharon Mizota. I work as a DEI metadata consultant, which means that I help museums, archives, and libraries bring their metadata in line with their goals for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm just going to do a brief land acknowledgement here. I come to you today from the unceded territories of the Tongva and Chumash peoples. I acknowledge the devastation of colonial warfare and cultural genocide that separated these nations and all Indigenous peoples in North America from control of their homelands. I acknowledge that I have benefited from this separation, and I honor and pay respect to these ancestors and communities who continue to nurture life on this land, and I support them in the resurgence of Indigenous rights and sovereignty. So my first slide is, why is DEI important for digital asset management? First of all, it's about people, right? So I know we, as digital asset managers, we are focused on assets, we're focused on things and objects, and a lot of times that takes over, and we forget about the people that are represented in our collections. So DEI, or bringing a DEI lens to your metadata, allows you to show respect and care for the artists and the creators who have made the objects that are represented in your collections, the people who are depicted in those images, and the users and employees and other people who interface with your collections on a daily basis. So this is all about making sure that the way in which you use language, the way in which you use words in your metadata is not creating offense or harm for the people who interface, who create this kind of community of care around the objects and the assets in your collections. It's also important to bring this lens to your metadata because it allows you to answer questions about your collections, right? So in the last few years, we've seen an increasing number of questions of how many women artists are represented in your collections, how many Black artists, how many LGBTQ artists. So being able to create a lens into these different identities around how your collection is representing various groups of people because has become a really important data point to capture. And until very recently, a lot of museums were not capturing this data at all, or they were not capturing it in any systematic way. So introducing identity facets, diversity, equity, and inclusion values into your metadata allows you to answer these questions. And then it's also just the right thing to do, right? We never want to have our collections or the way in which we describe our collections create harm or offense among our various audiences. So in the work that I've done with different organizations, especially with museums, there are a few things that appear to be common challenges, right? So the first one is outdated or offensive legacy metadata. This may be, many museums are hundreds of years old and they have descriptions that were written a really long time ago. So they reflect values and attitudes that are no longer acceptable or no longer appropriate. So some of the things I've seen in museum metadata are the use of older place names, right? So like the Dutch East Indies or Siam, where that should now be Indonesia or Thailand. And one of the solutions that we suggest in this case is not to replace those old place names, like of course those are historically accurate place names, but to also provide the contemporary place name, because that acknowledges a kind of thread, a historical thread that connects that current place to the historical artifacts or the historical objects that are in your collections from that place. Another aspect of this is terms to describe people, such as Oriental, right? We're talking about Asian people or East Asian people in particular. Oriental used to be a very common term, is now considered offensive. So we want to make sure that we're at least aware, if we can't remediate, we're at least aware of the places in our collections where this metadata may reflect older or offensive values. Another area is racist or derogatory place names. Some of you may have seen here in the United States, the Department of the Interior recently announced that they are changing all of the place names that use the word squaw, right, which is a derogatory term for Indigenous North American woman. And so that's helpful, right? Because then all of our vocabularies will be updated, but there are still a lot of place names out there that use racist or derogatory terminology because they were like the N-word, or I've even seen chink used as a derogatory, as a place name, in a place name. And so these terms, we still, in some cases, necessarily have to use them because that is still the name of the place. And until they get changed, one way to handle this is to create like a harmful language tag or a harmful language warning so that people know that this is, part of your metadata and are aware. And that you're aware. That's the important part too. And we'll talk about harmful language warnings in a second. Another area that this comes up in is terminology that centers the West. So again, this has to do with regions. So terms like the Near East, the Middle East, those places are only east of Europe, right? They're not east for Asia, like they are Central Asia, West Asia, right? So we're not centering the continent that we're talking about, we're centering a European mindset when we use terms like that. And then finally, another area that has been a challenge is describing historical people. So for example, Michelangelo, we think of as an Italian artist, but in his day, he would have identified as Florentine because Florence was a city-state and Italy as a nation that, as we know it now, did not exist. And so there's a tension between, how we would think of Michelangelo now as an Italian artist and how he identified then. And so in those cases, we want to assign maybe both terms, Florentine and Italian, so that we're respecting both how he saw himself back in the day and how we now need to be able to access him, right? Access his works. Another example that has come up is the Roman Emperor Trajan, right? So we think of Trajan, he may be represented in your collections, right, as an emperor. We think of him as Roman, but he was actually born in what is now Spain. So would we tag him as Spanish? Like, I don't think so, because that was not really part of his identity then, and it's not sort of how we think of him now. So these are the kinds of like nuanced decisions that you might have to make when you're confronted with these challenges in description. I mentioned the harmful content statement. This is a snippet of a longer statement that comes from the Huntington. I was not involved in writing this statement, but there are a number of great statements out there that you can use as a template and a model for different language that you may need to use depending on the content of your metadata and the content of your collections. Cataloging Lab is a website that has a great list of statements about bias in library and archives description. There are a few museums on that list as well, and a lot of the language, like the Digital Public Library of America has a great harmful content statement that's very comprehensive, and they actually encourage people to take their statement and repurpose it and reuse it. So there's a lot of models out there for how to create this kind of language to make sure that you're alerting visitors, users of your eDAMS, and people on your website that they may come across these examples of harmful or offensive language. And so now we come to the issue of controlled vocabularies. And this is always difficult because, of course, standards are important. We want to make sure that we're using, we're using standards that allow us to repurpose and share and manage our metadata in a very streamlined and efficient way. But no vocabulary that I have come across is perfect in terms of how it represents people, right? So Getty vocabularies are very widely used in the museum field. They're great for objects, not so much for people. Yulon has a lot of artists represented in it, but it's really only the very prominent ones and mostly European ones. So it doesn't actually, it's not actually a great resource when you have a lot of different creators from different backgrounds represented in your collection. Library of Congress demographic group terms is pretty good for describing contemporary groups of people, but not so much for the historical groups, right? Because it doesn't really have a lot of, like Florentine or these other terms that are historically important. Library of Congress subject headings is very uneven in the way that it describes people. So we have the Indians of North America issue, even though they recently changed illegal aliens to, what is it? I think it's non-citizens or something sort of better, but not perfect either. And so we have, it's an evolving process, but it moves very slowly, right, to get terms changed in the Library of Congress subject headings. And then finally, a resource that I've been pointing out to a lot of the people that I work with is Wikidata, which is much more up to date in terms of the terms. It has very much more contemporary terms and respectful terms for different groups of people. It is crowdsourced, which means you can add to it. If you don't find a term that you need, you can add to it and it becomes part of the Wikidata corpus. But being crowdsourced means that it's also prone to, it's prone to vandalization, right? People go in and change things because they can, and it's not as reliable as the vocabularies that are managed by a more central place. And it doesn't have much hierarchy. Hierarchy is really inconsistent. So if you need something that it's, you want to make sure that you're connecting things to broader terms or narrower terms, Wikidata is not going to really be much help in that regard because it's just not consistent enough. But it is a good way to kind of bring a lot of different vocabularies together in one place if you're thinking about making a custom taxonomy, which is pretty much what you have to do if you want to do a custom taxonomy. If you want to be able to describe people accurately and respectfully in your metadata, you're going to need to do some kind of customization. So if you're embarking on this project, it really is a research project. You need to figure out what language to use and what not to use. You want to make sure you know your collections and your audiences. What will they be looking for? What kind of language do they use? What are they familiar with? And what best represents your collection? It helps to develop a lexicon of problematic language that might be in your metadata. Clarissa Chu and the National Library of Scotland created a great resource called the Inclusive Terminology Project. It's a Google Drive. It has several different documents on different areas of description. It's very useful if you just need to know, like, what are the terms that I should be looking for, right? it's not going to necessarily, sometimes it makes recommendations of what you should use, but that is really going to be, up to you in terms of who your audience is and what you're how you're trying to represent your collections. Wikipedia also has a list of pejorative terms for people, which can be useful if you want to make sure that you're not using any of these terms in your metadata. And then once you've figured out, what the problem areas are, you want to look at what the preferred terminology should be. Of course, there are alternative vocabularies like homosaurus for LGBTQ identities and gender identities is very helpful. And then another resource that I point people to are journalistic style guides, such as the American Psychological Association has a lot of great guidelines for how to represent people, especially people with different health conditions or with different disabilities. And here are just a sampling of a few of the different resources that I've used to create custom taxonomies. The National Center on Disability and Journalism has a great disability language style guide, which has definitions and recommendations for preferred terminology, homosaurus, as I mentioned before. And the World Directory of Minorities and Indigenous Peoples is not really a style guide, but it has a very quick sort of easy gloss on the indigenous and minority populations in different countries. So if you're looking in a particular country, it will give you a little bit of information about the different populations that are relevant there. And that's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I would welcome questions, comments, feedback. I'm Sharon at sharonmizota.com, and thank you for your time today.
Sharon, thanks so much. We've had some interesting questions come in. I'm going to ask you one now, and then we'll join the rest later. And that is, where often do you see the many interesting statements published that you shared some templates and resources for, which is so helpful? Where should they be published?
Well, mostly they're published on public-facing websites. So if you have your assets on your website, if there's like a search the catalog function, there's usually a link there. It's not like, in some cases it's a pop-up. There are pop-ups that come up when you access, and those are usually kind of shorter summaries, and then they link to a disclaimer or to a statement of harmful content that's hosted on your website. That's the majority of the places that I've seen them appear is on those very public-facing situations. But I think it would be possible to do similar thing even in your internal DAM.
Well, very much so.
You could create a tag or some kind of message that comes up to alert people that there's some problematic content here.
Yeah, it's also we see this a lot when there are copyright or rights assertions that need to have some attestation before one can maybe even go into the system. So thank you for that, and the resource connections are much appreciated by all. Jaime, we're going to have a chance to hear from you here in just a moment. And I think when you and I first met, you were working at a treasure here in the nation's capital at Hillwood, if I recall correctly. And and it's been delightful to see you take the helm of the DAM system at the National Gallery of Art. Thanks for putting your thoughts together today, and over to you.
Sure. Thank you, David. Can you confirm that you're seeing my full slides okay?
Yes, we are.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And thank you, Sharon, for a wonderful presentation. Hi, everyone. My name is Jaime McCurry. I am the eDAM coordinator at the National Gallery of Art, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about what DAM is at the National Gallery, what that means for us, and the critical role that metadata plays in all of that. So to start with, let's talk about DAM at the gallery, and we call it eDAM essentially. That stands for Enterprise Digital Asset Management. You can see our program mission at the top of my slide here. Essentially, we exist in order to help staff and provide them with resources to efficiently manage the important digital assets that they're creating during their work or acquiring on a regular basis, storing safely, describing so things are findable later for use, managing managing overall, retrieving, sharing, all of the wonderful things that DAM application and DAM resources can provide. And that's overall to enable discovery, use, and sharing of these important resources from across the museum. We're representing multiple collection types in one safe place, the DAM system, and with ease. And we really view eDAM as a complete ecosystem at the museum. So it's a program first and foremost. It's made up of people, practices, workflows, the systems that we're providing, the services that we're providing, as well as the community who benefits from all of this. So what are some of the resources that we're providing? We're providing a DAM team, our expertise and guidance, not just on DAM practices, but also overall organizing your files, naming your files, creating folders on your servers, whatnot, and then getting into the DAM proper. We're made up of 2 people right now, myself, eDAM coordinator, and my teammate, Kate Mayo, our metadata specialist. I know she's listening in today, and I'll give her a special shout out. So much of what I'm about to share is thanks to her hard work and expertise. And we're responsible for administering overall the program, and a cornerstone of that is the application that we're using, a third-party software product, and the infrastructure that we're relying on. So currently we have our application installed in the cloud and our assets are hosted in the cloud. So working with our IT group on making sure everything's up to shape there and everything that comes along with that. Also responsible for providing various system integrations from the DAM system using its API. We're connected out to our collections management system, the public website. If you've ever interacted with nga.gov on our collections pages, the collection object images are coming from the DAM system, making that possible. We're also delivering out images to the intranet and the library database. We've got our library group on board in recent years, and we're really excited about the possibilities that are coming through there. And critically, as part of all of this, in addition to pure asset management through the DAM system, we're also providing easy self-serve access to key digital assets via a portal internally for staff, contractor, and intern use, making sure that people are getting at what they need pretty easy in a frictionless way, rather. So overall, we're responsible for over 1,345,000 assets, massive amount of collections. We're really excited for the adaptive use that we've seen. That's representative of just under 200 terabytes of data, I believe. And that comes from 8 departments who have been fully onboarded to date. The program sits within imaging, where the primary users responsible for collection object photography, event photography, and others. But as I've mentioned, we also have our archives department on board, our library group, and other key departments, such as various conservation users, painting conservation, we're looking at onboarding in the next few months, paper, photograph, and even groups like our architects and our engineers who might be using the DAM system to host new photography of their projects on site and on campus. And from those 8 departments, we've got 90 contributing users, people who are representing their departments in the DAM program and managing the assets that their departments are responsible for. And then from that big group, we're sharing out in an easy fashion over 300,000 assets to all staff for them to benefit from and browse and be inspired by and use in the ways that they need. And we've had over 520 staff members use this resource to date. So that's a really healthy rate of growth for us, and we're excited to keep growing from here. So through all of this, we of course care about metadata, right? It underpins everything that we do. And we especially care about enterprise metadata because we're representing multiple collection types, multiple user types. So we want to make sure that all of this information is cataloged in an appropriate way, but also in a flexible way, depending on the type and context of the digital asset that we're describing. So what we've done initially when we started our program, like I said, the gallery had been doing DAM for a while, but the current iteration of our program has been around for about 5 years. We took that opportunity to rethink and redo our schema, and we borrowed a lot from an existing schema widely known in the field, Dublin Core. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, right? And we wanted to go with something that people were familiar with, but we also wanted to be able to customize it in the ways that we needed to capture special information to us here at the museum. So we'd established what we call NGA Core, and that's essentially a base set, a core set of 12 fields It's basic information that we would expect from a cataloger when they're adding new assets to the system, but it's also basic information that a user might expect to come along with an asset that they're searching for and they're using. And this is what you could imagine when I say basic, right? It's the title of the asset, who created it, maybe a description, what you're seeing, what's the context, basic rights information, some keywords, and essentially who's the department responsible for that asset. So if you have a question about it, who do you go to ask, right? That set is intended to be used by novice catalogers, people who don't come from an information background, right? Like my teammate and I do. We're librarians. We're fortunate to work with librarians in our library group and archivists in our archives department. We're all really comfortable with descriptive practices, but we also have a user base, architects, for example, who just want to upload their latest project photos and apply information in a useful and easy way to them. So this is a great place to start, but we also recognize that you might want to add more information, right? So how do we really flex this out? And we looked at what other information could we add that could be kind of transferable across collections type and useful in multiple contexts. This means if you have an event photograph, you might want to catalog a geographic location or an NGA location, right? Pulling from controlled vocabularies where they exist. All other types of information, I think there is another additional kind of 20 fields here where we can flesh out rights information and anything else that you might want to know about that object, regardless of what it is or where it comes from. And in relation to all of that, we want to make sure we're capturing specific information relevant to the file type. And this could often mean technical information as well, outside of what the system is capturing by default. So we in our system mostly have images. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of audio and video. So we worked with our subject matter experts across the museum to determine what information we needed to capture according to the asset type. For our images, we worked with the photographers to figure out that we want to note the color profile or the image white point or the capture device, maybe create a controlled list of the cameras that are on hand so we can capture that information more easily. Audio, video files. For videos, I know we have color characteristic. Is this video in color or is it black and white? Making sure there's enough space for the right information where we need it to be. And then from here, beyond that, we recognize that we'll get into more specialized needs. We, within the eDAMS program, work with authoritative information sources outside of our system. So our archives group, they have a records management database. Our library group, they have a bibliographic database, and they have very specialized needs for tracking information. So we worked with them to determine that we have fields in place that can be added on per asset if it matches that content type that is appropriate. So an archivist might want to add a digital asset title, right? But they would also want to add the record group or record series that that archival material came from, making sure we have corresponding fields in the eDAMS to fit that. Library bibliographic data. In our imaging group, we manage a lot of like workflow-oriented attribute fields. So if an image is approved for maybe web use, but not necessarily for high-level publication, and a review would be needed before we would publish it out in a print publication, we would want to note that in the metadata, and we have a space there. Conservation, if it's a collection object photograph, at what point in the conservation process was that created, before, during, or after treatment? So this really creates a system where it's dynamic and you can adapt it depending on the content type that you're cataloging, starting from the very basic NGA core to the more specialized fields as needed. And through that, we also have some sets established for our integrations, collections management system, collection object data coming over from that system, and also workflow-oriented fields for our web publishing protocols. And like I've said, our goal in all of this is to remain simple, standardized, but be flexible where we can, use controlled vocabularies where possible. And that's all to make sure that this is actually useful in the ways that we need it to be. So what are we really describing? This is one of my favorite examples. This is an image of a painting in our collection called Ginevra da Vinci. It's by Leonardo da Vinci. It is actually the only Leonardo da Vinci painting on public view in the United States today. So if you ever get the chance to come to DC and see it in person, it is a really special experience. So what you're seeing here on the left-hand side of the screen is our authoritative collection object image that comes from our painting studio. It is the latest and greatest picture of this painting that we have. It's available on our website, open access for public download. It's what our curators use in their research and their presentations, everything like that. But if you were to type into our system a search for Ginevra da Benci, you would find over 1,400 results because we have so much other content related to that painting in our collections. We have, for example, in the center here, event images and images of people interacting with the painting at the museums. This is one of my absolute favorite images here at the bottom, a young girl viewing the painting on display with her mother. She's so excited by what she's seeing that she's doing a little dance in front of the painting. And then we also have these really great images from our archives group on the top right. I think this is a view maybe of the painting, one of the very first times that it was put on public display at the gallery in the 1960s. So making sure we're capturing and communicating the appropriate information about that event and the archival information that goes along with it. And a plethora of behind the scenes kind of data around the painting as well, and images and other information. This is actually a behind the scenes view of our paintings photographer capturing what I believe is the image that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen here in his state-of-the-art studio. So we really want to consider what's the context of this asset, what is its purpose, and then catalog according to that. So for the collection object image, we would apply the collection object data and technical information about the file and the studio and all of that. But for example, a related image, we would call this a people photograph, right? Because the focus of the image is people. We're cataloging information from a number of sets, including maybe pulling from NGA core to catalog basic title. We know who the creator is, the date that it was created. We're applying basic keywords so that it's easily searchable, and we can surface this along with groups of similar images where need be. We're making sure we've got that description in there, including, because there's artwork visible, we're including the artwork title, the accession number, and the artist. This won't get the full collection object record from our CMS, but if you search on that title, artist, or accession number in the system, it's surfacing appropriately. And then we realized we wanted to flesh out the record a little bit using the other sets we have available. So our extended, we wanted to characterize our creator as being the photographer of this image, as opposed to an image technician who might have just made color edits, right? We're adding an NGA location. We love to search by location, especially for our event and campus photographs, to see where this was captured, and this was in our West building. We're also incorporating some administrative metadata, getting into kind of some workflows. This is an image that really fits within our new brand guidelines. So we reviewed this through the lens of our brand, and our brand director decided that, yes, this is appropriate to use for those kinds of needs. So we've recorded that decision here, along with basic information about any restrictions that might exist or other technical data, camera, et cetera. And this could look different for any type of asset, depending on what you're cataloging in the system. So we've done a lot of work on the schemas. We're about 5 years in, as I've mentioned. What is our current focus? What's to come? Currently, we're interested in reviewing our schemas and soliciting feedback. We're going to be reaching out to our eDAMS stakeholders soon to do a comprehensive eDAMS survey to learn more about where we can improve. We'll include lots of questions about metadata there. We're also experimenting with keyword lists and user tagging, figuring out what keywords we can provide that are useful, but also what keywords we need to add to that list based on our user interests and needs. We're interested in using metadata to facilitate collaborative workflows, like that brand project that I'd mentioned, surfacing images to our brand director so she can approve them for brand use, marking those decisions in the metadata. And then we're increasing the use of the metadata to trigger automated workflows. We want to work smarter, not harder, and leverage the data there in a more seamless fashion to make some things happen, maybe automagically where possible. We're also exploring additional ways to incorporate and leverage embedded metadata. This could be metadata, or rather embedded metadata that's created at the time of the creation of the asset. So can we work, for example, with our photographers to figure out what's possible with the creative software that they're using to embed key information at that time? But it also means leveraging the data in the DAM as well, figuring out what we can embed from the DAM on download, so important key information can travel with the assets indefinitely, right? And then also looking at refining, rights and reproductions related metadata practices, especially important as we're now providing easier access to a large set of images and other types of assets in a more seamless fashion to our all staff audience. So people want to know, what is this thing? How can I use it? Who can I contact if I have a question about how to use that? Making sure that's all transparent. And we would also like to maybe consider linking out to some outside taxonomies and ontologies over time. Right now, for our controlled vocabularies, we're using pretty much local data sets, but can we, for example, in the future, pull from the Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus? That might be a really great option. So exploring what that might look like. And underpinning this all, a priority, of course, is to continue thinking about ways in which we can improve the metadata through the lens of DEAI. Recently, we've been able to pull from a project at the museum, which we're really happy with, in that staff have been describing images of our collection objects for those that might have visual impairments, and we're making those artwork descriptions available in the DAM, and we're publishing them out to the website. That all comes through the DAM, so adding to metadata that facilitates accessibility, but also thinking about other ways in which we can make the data that we're tracking and keeping more equitable, diverse, and inclusive as well. So that's it for me. I know we have a couple of other fantastic presentations in the line. Thank you for your time today.
Jamie, thanks so much. A question came in, I think, when you had that lovely little double exclamation mark over there that said, actually useful. Something we all sometimes kind of bang our heads about. And it's a question directly related to that. How many core fields are required for an asset to be an asset?
Wow, that's a great question. And I'll be honest with you, we have some assets in our DAM that are not cataloged yet, but they're just as useful. But there's, I think, the question of also, what does useful mean and what's our purpose for this asset? We might want to just keep it safe right now, so it's okay that it doesn't have much data applied. But if we want to use it, distribute it over time, we'll need to be adding data in order to make that possible. So what does that look like? For us, our core set contains about 12 fields. That doesn't mean they're literally mandatory when you're cataloging, but it means that we strongly encourage you to fill out as many of those fields as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a very thoughtful answer to the question. There is always that core set, but in addition, DAM has so many other behaviors that can support useful workflows. If there is something that needs to just be a placeholder asset, where maybe even the visual is not displayed, and it has very spare metadata, so it can be restricted through any number of ways. We might ask John to talk a bit about that, and how, when there's a period of heavy ingest, what are some of the tools within typical digital asset management systems that can adjudicate different needs during a lot of uploading situations. Thank you for that. We've had some other questions come in. Stay tuned. I'll be back with them. All right. So Phil, it's been so nice to get to meet you and to become acquainted as we've been working on this panel. We'd like to turn the Zoom land over to you.
Excellent. All righty. Can folks see my my slide there?
Yes.
Great. So hi, I'm Phil Seibel. I'm with Aldis Systems. My chief task when it comes to working with whether it be educational institutions or cultural organizations has to do with trying to ensure smooth processes when it comes to actually getting into your system and crafting taxonomy, having ontological discourse. One of the things I wanted to address, kind of a 10,000-foot view, are really common challenges that I see a lot of folks having when it comes to managing your taxonomy over time and dealing with change management. So I thought that I'd just briefly touch on, differences in personnel who are cataloging the content, adapting the language you're using for multiple audiences, and updating that language in response to societal growth and change. So first off, differences in cataloging personnel. Catalogers may have very specific knowledge bases that help them, whether they're a researcher who has come on board to assist in enriching a collection and objects, or whether they're just staff that have been there and have accrued an extraordinary amount of experience over time. You want to make sure that these individuals, while they are unique and important with respect to their role in the institution, that you can document as much as possible of what they're doing, so you can spread the knowledge that they are utilizing to enrich your collection to as many personnel as possible. and to make sure that should they leave the institution, that knowledge base is not just lost, so you don't wind up suddenly at a deficit. So with that in mind too, make sure there's as much cross training as possible as you bring new people on. I mean, there are a lot of databases and taxonomic lists and discussions around ontology, but at the end of the day, the people that you have invested in these places and bringing their knowledge, whether it be from a personal background or an educational background or an experiential background, are really the key to making sure that all of these things connect with people on the other side of the screen or who are coming into a given institution to look around. So again, using the right terms for your audience. Researchers, students, kids, people who are just wandering in off the street to check things out, they're all approaching these collections with an extraordinary variety of knowledge bases and backgrounds. The terminology that you use in an educational institution that may be a scientific name means a lot to a researcher, but might not mean something to somebody just coming in off the street. So you have to make sure that you're capable of having that ontological discussion of saying, well, what term works well for what we're trying to educate people on and how we're trying to execute on connecting with a community or a group of people, whether that be in a web space, or if you're looking at your internal DAM capacities for letting researchers find things, bring it back to do some work, whether it be in a paper or presentation of their own, or making sure that your exhibits committees, whether it be for the web or the physical space, are capable of finding the right asset for the right presentation. Like Jamie was saying, you could see that there are these different attributes that have to do with whether it's the physical object that is the actual piece of art, or if it's some sort of a derivation that's being utilized to present it in the web or show an aspect of patron experience when it comes to actually getting in front of the camera and seeing something cool. So I think that there's a lot to be said for figuring out exactly how you're going to layer terminology and create taxonomies that are capable of tying together primary, secondary, tertiary terminology. As Sharon was saying before, there may be terms that inform the historical context of things you don't necessarily want the public to encounter as the first step in their journey in discovering things, because there may be cultural sensitivity around it. And so making sure that there are representative terms that resonate well with the audience you're trying to reach and represent and the communities you're trying to be in touch with is an extraordinarily important thing, while not losing the historical context of terminology that may or may not be problematic. So again, getting into that once more, updating language in response to societal growth, change, wider education of people with respect to cultural respect, social movements that have rallied around traditionally marginalized groups, finding those unified voices, bringing them into your process, trying to crowdsource tagging, finding places inside of your institution where you can have community leaders that will take in all of that feedback and provide it context within your collections is extraordinarily important. Find yourself somebody like Sharon who can come in and who's made their work about making sure that those voices get heard and they're properly represented, and cultural sensitivity flags become front and center with respect to how you're actually engaging this content. So, listening to the communities you're trying to reach out to is, vital. There's no other way to make sure that what you're doing resonates with the people that you're trying to represent and the educational goals of your institution. So that's all for me. I was really trying to take a 10,000-foot view there. So I'll hand it off to the next person.
Phil, thanks so much. And Sharon, I'd be leery of that invitation since you're in Southern California and Phil is in Minnesota. So, just take it with a seasonal grain of salt. Phil, I'm wondering if you've had any experience where you've been involved in a project and there was embedded metadata that came, perhaps, as Jamie mentioned, when the tool creating the binary object injected some metadata with it, or it came trundling along from an antecedent collection, and that needed to be interrogated and updated. It certainly touches also what Sharon was talking about, but I was wondering if you had any exposure to where embedded metadata presented an issue at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. We have one client that we worked with where a lot of the information that came in was from Shutterstock, Getty, various places where AI has been utilized to generate a lot of the tagging. The content that came in that had to do with things related to COVID-19 in particular had some extraordinarily racially insensitive information about Asian Americans in it. And that was a constant battle to mitigate those tags and make sure that they were, expunged from whatever records we were making sure then got through. It was, it's one of those things that the AI could see it happening in online discourse and associated terminology with the image without any capacity for understanding cultural sensitivity for what it was presenting. So it's one of those things, there was no actual value in that metadata. It was just the darker side of human nature being adopted by AI. And so it's extraordinarily important to perform quality control, even when you're trying to leverage really interesting technology, because the machines just don't understand, what they're doing. They give you a jumping off point, but they're not the final say in terms of what human beings will or will not find offensive or unconscionable.
Great. Thank you for that. And I'll use that as a jumping off point. I've asked John to share a few thoughts about there are so many tools that are involved in creating metadata. And there's so much science in machine learning, in natural language processing, in other ways that we can either find use or abuse of in terms of adding metadata. And John, in his role, I'd like him to introduce himself a bit, is exposed to a lot of how can we, when we do find tools that help to develop metadata to surround an asset, how do we learn to look at those? What are some ones that seem valuable, and some cautionary notes? And John, thanks for joining us today. It's always great to see you.
Yeah, thank you, David, and apologize for being late. And if I disappear all of a sudden, there's a guy out my window on a ladder where my internet comes in. So hoping for the best.
Yeah, us too.
Yeah, so as David said, I'm John Florance. I've been involved in this industry quite a long time, but I've been involved in digital since almost day one. I've got a basement full of old software that a lot of it has 1.0 on it. And, the reason I mention that is that you guys have described, everyone on the panel has described some great use cases of metadata in not just organizing and managing content, but making that available to the public and the various channels. And, that's all great. But every once in a while, things go wrong, and I'm that guy they call. So, we've done some things with AI. We've done some things with embedded metadata, presented those from people's dams directly to the public. And I should mention, I work in the museum space, but I also work in the commercial space. And part of the reason is the tools that we use behind the scenes, kind of in the back room, they're all fairly common. We're all using the same utilities. A lot of times content comes from common places, particularly on things that are born digital. And so a lot of what I've dealt with are, as David alluded earlier, I deal with things like bad metadata in the wrong field that was embedded 15 years ago, but I also deal with things that are related to capacity. What happens when you roll out, a new website where you're pulling stuff from your dam and the whole world discovers it on the first day and they all want to go pull it. I've dealt with a couple of those, where you expect 10,000 hits a day and you get 1.5 million. What do you do in those situations? And, I think the one thing I would say is that I've spent my life telling people, put your metadata in the dam, put your assets, your files in the dam, link it together, make it available through APIs or through the UI. But I would say in my later years, I'm starting to come around, probably through the coaching of some of my museum customers, that, there are different strategies. And when you start talking about capacity and quality, sometimes you do have to start abstracting your dam and splitting up the responsibilities so you can have higher quality and say how you manage your metadata. You know, there was a mention of taking metadata from outside sources and bringing that in. If you're trying to do that all through one box, if you're trying to do that through one user interface, you know, it means that you can affect the user experience for your internal staff and researchers, and also, you know, have negative consequences on those users who say are accessing your dam through a CMS, that kind of thing. Oh, David,
There.
you're on mute.
Yeah, I know. Just you'd think it would just like, no, I want to talk.
Yeah.
Sort of Zoom ESP. I keep waiting for that to happen. Jamie, we had an interesting question come in. Do you have a circumstance where you need to adjudicate metadata coming from a contractor? So a videographer, a drone operator, independent photographer. There was the time when the east building was all the facades were being replaced. And the contractor had to take pictures of every stone that was being removed and number it. One of my favorite sources of metadata that has no meaning in the aesthetic world, but you had to get it right to get the stone back on right. So have you had circumstances where you've asked contractors to bring metadata in along with what they're being paid to do and have had to manage that closely?
There are some circumstances where, and I'm thinking particularly of our architecture and engineering group, where they're having contractors create photography for on-site projects, but those deliverables are being channeled through a gallery employee who we've onboarded as a DAM representative for their department. So they're then taking control and contributing the metadata in the system. So they may be requesting basic information from the contractor, like on what day did you create this and where did you shoot this at the gallery, but they're filtering that and applying the information themselves in the system, and we've trained them on how to do that, right? And there's certain kind of filters of access too for those assets that I'd mentioned earlier. We may just want to keep them in a safe place, and that would be the DAM system, and apply the basic information that we've had, but then we can go up the levels. If we're going to be distributing an asset for internal or external use at any point, there would then be a more formal review process of the metadata that exists, so we can clean up that record and make sure it's distributable in that sense. So it depends on the context and the use and where we're at with that asset itself.
And I think we should all make note, and it comes from something that Jonathan said earlier from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. You just can't predict every unexpected use of DAM. And as the National Gallery of Art did undertake the replating of the East Building, and the architect and engineering staff used DAM to keep all those images. And now, is that why NGA bought DAM? I don't think so. But I love the thinking in that and the capacity for encountering unexpected use cases. And that's what we want DAM leaders to do today, to be at the ready for that. So Sharon, speaking of being at the ready, we had an interesting question come in. Sharon, what's your advice for getting institutional buy-in for a project devoted to going through and doing, we'll call it a DEIA audit, review, operational assessment?
Yeah, that can be challenging because, you know, as we've been talking about all these machine solutions, like things are just getting faster and faster. And what DEIA really requires is kind of slowing down, right? And so making the case to your higher ups, your decision makers, to spend the time and the resources to actually get it right is really important. So I mean, one of the approaches that I advise is like search, sample, and survey, not necessarily all in that order, but you want to like kind of take some really powerful case studies out of your metadata, right? So you can search your collections, do a survey of areas that you know may be problematic, and actually pull up concrete examples and show them, you know, how this may be impacting users, or how you're presenting a kind of unsavory picture of your collection because you're using terminology that is outdated, offensive. You know, it helps to have like very specific cases to kind of anchor your ask. and say, this is why we need to fix this. This is why we need to redress this. And it's not going to be, we can't just do a global search and replace, right? Because sometimes the terminology is, as Phil was saying, historically important, right? And you want to preserve it. There isn't always going to be an easy machine solution. But you have to make the case that this is important because it affects people and the image of your institution in terms of how it represents and how it respects different audiences.
Great, thank you for that. Phil, related to this, we had a question come in about, okay, we've spent a lot, we want to devote the energy to our metadata and to its inclusive nature. And have you seen circumstances where an asset's use is tracked, where the eDAMS system follows where an asset goes, and any insights about metadata that have come from that or that generating metadata, kind of the where used idea, if you will?
Is that for me or for anybody?
Oh, I would love it if Phil has an answer,
Yeah.
any
Okay.
idle speculation. Or just some
Yes.
circumstances about that. Sharon,
I'm
I
sorry, I
got
didn't
plenty
catch
for
my name
you.
if you
Don't
threw it
worry.
at me. My bad.
That's okay.
Yeah, no, we have definitely seen that where there have been places where it's like, well, this is being used. And I think, again, I think the COVID one is a major one to talk about, because that's something where the information was immediately necessary due to the nature of the pandemic and the nature of the imagery that was being put out there to attempt to arrest people's attention and make sure that they're seeing these resources as educational, as valid, and trying to find ways to make sure that information gets out there to everybody. And to also circle back to the thing you brought up with Sharon, I think that one of the best ways to gain buy-in from an institution is to say, look, this is going to hit your bottom line in terms of finance. I think you can directly say, if you alienate a group of people by being insensitive to how they're represented here, you're going to see it in your funding, in your grants, you're going to see it all over the map. And it's going to do that damage to your image as an institution and as a cultural representation in general is extraordinarily hard to undo if you don't get out in front of it. So in looking at the COVID materials and seeing how they were getting out there, and even just the the alt text that you see when you hover over images and all those tags pop up a lot of the time, if that hasn't been curated in any fashion and you suddenly see that it's been used in thousands of publications or web pages that have been hit while people are trying to gain information about something that is as urgent as the pandemic was, that's a major issue that you need to figure out how to remediate immediately. So that's something where we've definitely seen that encountered much more in terms of when people are trying to do that process of fast gathering assets and pushing them out for immediacy of use. When it's an educational thing that has that sort of, front line of image use.
Thank you. Appreciate that and good guidance. We're gonna do two kind of flashcard questions. So Jamie, are you ready in our last couple of minutes? Do the library system and the archive systems, the question was phrased plug in, which I think is kind of too one directional. But do you have any kind of API or automated connection with your library and archive systems?
We do with our library systems. It is one way currently in that the DAM is sending their images that they're cataloging in the DAM over to their bibliographic database. Not yet with the archival systems. They're actually more on a FileMaker database type setup. So there's not an API that is available to us to connect to, but in the future, we hope there might be.
Let us know when FileMaker Pro has an API. Oh no, wait a minute. Yeah, forget that.
I think we'll be moving and maybe eventually, but yeah.
Yeah, call John. He knows about that technical stuff. So John, I noticed you did have your hand up, and why don't you go ahead and fire away.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put my hand up.
That's
It was
okay.
an accident. No, I didn't have any comment on that. Sorry.
No, that's absolutely just fine. There's something that's a little bit of hold it in a mirror to a lot of things that we're talking about today. And that's the need, and I mentioned this earlier, to guard against punitive defunding, censorship, and institutional risk, not from inclusion, but from the act of inclusion. And it's an unnerving social pattern to be accused of something by asserting inclusion and equality and accessibility. And I was wondering if the implications from that have come onto any of your radars yet, in terms of it's another form of institutional risk, as Phil, just to use that word, and Sharon used that word very thoughtfully also, but it's a very negative, it's an incursion, a very unpleasant incursion to be accused of something through acts of inclusion. So I was wondering if this had come in, Sharon, in any of your project discussions yet about being aware of that as an outcome, a possible outcome.
No, I have not encountered that. I think a lot of the projects, I've only been working as a consultant for about 2 years. So a lot of the projects that I've consulted on haven't kind of completed the cycle maybe, and been around long enough to have garnered a negative reaction. But the response that I've gotten from the different communities that I've worked with has been overwhelmingly positive, in that, you know, if you want to be represented, better represented, then I want to help institutions do that better, right?
Good.
If you don't want to be represented, then, you know, then I'm not your person. Like I'm all about helping to make representation better if that's what you want. So yeah.
Well, I think making representation better is a theme that all 4 of you have shared with me today and with our audience from around the world. I'd like to thank you for your time and for joining us and for sharing so many things that each of you have learned. Look forward to welcoming you back in the future where we can hear about your progress on each of these projects. So thank you all for your time today. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thanks, David.
Thank you so much, David.
Next up, we're going to hear from the Fine Art Museums of San Francisco on why rights and rights management are such a big deal. So I'll be back shortly to start that session. Thank you all.